Amina, equally stunned, replied, Dan? It was as if time stood still. Memories from another life came rushing back, and for a moment Dan was frozen in place. Amina opened the door, standing there with a composed smile. What? How? Dan stammered, searching for the right words. Amina simply greeted him with a polite smile, though her heart raced with a mix of emotions. Dan stood there, staring at her, trying to process what he was feeling. As if a dam had broken in his mind, memories of their relationship came flooding back. He spread his arms instinctively, stepping forward as he said, My love, how did you disappear? Amina's expression shifted to confusion and then disbelief. What? She said. You are the one who left me for my best friend Katie. Her words hit Dan like a bolt of lightning. He stood there, stunned, as the truth of his actions collided with the emotions rushing back to him. Before he could respond, Amina's phone rang, pulling her attention away. After a brief conversation, she turned back to Dan. I must go. My car is waiting, she said, stepping past him. Dan reached for her arm gently. But we need to talk, Amina. Please. Amina hesitated for a moment, then looked into his eyes with a calm yet firm expression. I'm sorry, Dan, but I have nothing to say. She walked away, leaving Dan standing there, overwhelmed with a storm of emotions and unanswered questions. Dan couldn't let Amina walk away. He chased after her, calling her. Amina, Amina, please, just let me talk to you, at least that. Amina stopped, her shoulders tense. She turned around and said calmly, Dan, I have somewhere to be. Please, this isn't the time. Dan's face was filled with desperation, but Amina sighed, opened her bag, and pulled out a small card. Handing it to him, she said, Call me after 10 p.m. With that, she walked away, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. Dan stood frozen, staring at the card in his hand as though it were a lifeline. The rest of Dan's day unraveled. He couldn't focus on work, couldn't eat or drink. His thoughts were consumed by Amina. Her face, her voice, and her words replayed in his mind on an endless loop. For the first time in years, Dan felt the weight of his past mistakes crushing down on him. As the clock struck 10 p.m., Dan dialed the number on the card. His hands trembled as he held the phone to his ear. Amina answered, her voice calm but weary. Dan, I'm tired. Can we meet tomorrow instead? Dan's heart sank, but he quickly agreed. Of course. Where should we meet? There's a local restaurant near the workplace. Let's meet there after work. 6 p.m., Amina suggested. Dan breathed a sigh of relief. Thank you, Amina. I'll see you tomorrow. As he hung up, he felt a mixture of anxiety and hope. Tomorrow would be his chance to make things right, or at least to finally say the words he'd been holding on to. That night, Dan couldn't sleep. His mind raced, trying to piece together how he had ended up with Katie. Memories of Amina flooded back, crystal clear, and the depth of his love for her consumed him. Yet a fog lingered over how he had transitioned from being with Amina to marrying Katie and having children. It was as if his mind refused to connect the dots, leaving him frustrated and restless. The next day, Dan left work early, already seated at the restaurant 20 minutes before the agreed time. He didn't want to miss the chance to talk to Amina. His heart pounded as he anxiously watched the door. Just after 6 p.m., Amina walked in. She scanned the room briefly before spotting Dan, who stood up to signal her. With a calm demeanor, Amina joined him at the corner table. Dan called the waiter over and without hesitation ordered Amina's usual, a gesture that caught her off guard. For a moment they sat in silence. Dan, struggling to find the right words, finally said, Amina, I'm so sorry for everything. How have you been? Amina smirked slightly and shook her head, her expression unreadable. Dan hesitated before continuing. I don't even know how I ended up with Katie, how I married her, or how we have 2 children. Seeing you again, it's like everything came back, and now I'm realizing my heart has always been with you. Amina raised an eyebrow, her expression sharpening. Children? She repeated, her voice cold. Dan, are you listening to yourself? You came all this way just to humiliate me again? Wasn't it enough the first time? Please, Amina, Dan pleaded, his voice breaking. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't remember. Maybe you can help me. Please. Amina's eyes narrowed. You don't remember? Really? You don't remember confessing your love for Katie in front of me? You don't remember how I found you two in the pool together? At that moment, the waiter returned with drinks and snacks, interrupting the rising tension. Once he left, Amina continued, her voice steady but laced with pain. Dan, I was 5 weeks pregnant. I didn't know until I ended up in the hospital. I lost the baby. Worse, I lost the ability to ever conceive again because of the complications. They had to remove my uterus. Dan's face fell, his head bowing in shame. What? You mean we were having a baby? He whispered, his voice breaking. Amina nodded, her voice unwavering. Yes. And then I heard about your so-called wedding of the century. It broke me all over again. I ended up back in the hospital. If it weren't for my family and therapy, I don't know where I'd be right now. Dan tried to place his hand on hers, but Amina pulled away, her expression firm. I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with regret. Amina sighed. I've already forgiven you, Dan. Not for you, but for my own peace. Dan looked at her, tears forming in his eyes. Amina, I don't know how this happened. I swear I don't remember. It's like something took over me. I barely remember getting together with Katie. I don't know. But before this trip, I started feeling like I didn't belong with her, like my life with her wasn't real. Seeing you again confirmed it. My heart has always been with you. Amina shook her head. Dan, this is serious. You need to figure out what happened to you. The food arrived, but Amina didn't touch it. I'm not hungry, she said, pushing the plate aside. Dan didn't press her, understanding the gravity of the moment. I'm sorry, Amina, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I've moved on, Dan, Amina said firmly. I had to, for my own sanity. I left so I wouldn't have to see you or hear about your love nest with Katie. Dan nodded slowly. I understand, but please let me figure this out. Maybe I can fix this. Amina's gaze softened slightly, but she remained resolute. Good luck. You'll need it. She glanced at her watch and sighed. I'm going now, she said, collecting her bag and standing up. They had been talking for over 2 hours, yet there was still so much left unsaid. Can we keep in contact, please? Dan asked, his voice filled with desperation. Amina paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. I don't want trouble, she replied firmly. There'll be none, I promise, Dan said, repeating himself earnestly. Amina hesitated before nodding slightly and walking out of the restaurant. Dan remained seated, sipping his whiskey as Amina's words replayed in his mind. The untouched food sat in front of him, cold and forgotten, as his thoughts spiraled further into the past and the mess he was now desperate to untangle. The next day, Dan wanted to reach out to Amina, but hesitated, fearing she might not respond. Instead, he sent a text message. Just checking in. Are you okay? Hours later, Amina replied simply, never better. Dan stared at the screen, her words both reassuring and bittersweet. The work trip soon came to an end, and Dan returned home. Yet, his mind lingered on Amina, unable to shake the encounter or the feelings it had stirred within him. Back home, Dan decided to reach out to Paul. They arranged to meet, choosing a quiet spot where they could talk privately. Paul was initially guarded, but eventually opened up, recounting everything about Katie's recent behavior. She wasn't present anymore, Paul said, always making excuses, disappearing for long hours. Then one day, she decided to leave. I only heard about her wedding to you, the same way everyone else did. Paul took a deep breath. I thought about chasing after her, but I decided not to. Dan interrupted, saying one thing I do remember, though, is that Katie was hitting on me for a while before all this. I just didn't press on it. I should have seen it coming. Dan continued solemnly. It's strange, he said. It's like something took over me. I don't remember how we got together, let alone married. I spoke to Amina, and it's like her presence brought everything back. But there's still this gap I can't explain. Paul's expression softened. I've moved on from Katie, he admitted. I found someone else, and we just got married 4 months ago. I'm happy now. My focus is on trying to get custody of my child. Katie won't let me see Clara. Dan's brow furrowed. Katie told me you didn't want anything to do with Clara, he said. Paul scoffed, shaking his head. Of course she did. That's Katie for you. But it's not true. Clara's my daughter, and I'll do whatever it takes to be part of her life. Dan sat back, processing Paul's words. He couldn't deny the growing unease about Katie and the mysterious fog surrounding his own decisions. For the first time, he began to seriously question not just his feelings, but the circumstances that had brought him to this point. During this, Paul and Dan found an unexpected bond. Their shared experiences of betrayal and loss brought them together, forming a friendship built on mutual understanding. Through Paul, Dan learned more about Katie's manipulations and lies. The stories were difficult to hear, but served to strengthen Dan's resolve to leave Katie and move forward. He realized how deeply he had been deceived and how much he had lost because of it. Good luck with the custody battle, Dan told Paul during one of their conversations. Clara deserves a stable and loving parent. I know you'll do everything you can for her. Paul nodded, gratitude in his eyes. Thanks, Dan. I'm just trying to do what's right for her. And as for you, I hope you find clarity and peace. The two men parted ways, each with their own battles ahead, but strengthened by their newfound friendship. Dan's journey toward breaking free from Katie's grasp began with a clearer sense of purpose, while Paul prepared to step into the courtroom and fight for Clara's future. Katie began to sense that the spell she had cast over Dan was no longer working. His behavior had shifted. He was distant, no longer engaging in arguments, and quietly gathering his belongings. While Dan avoided confrontations, Katie grew increasingly anxious, making repeated visits to the voodoo practitioner in a desperate attempt to restore the spell. The practitioner, however, could offer no solutions, leaving Katie more panicked with each passing day. In her frantic state, Katie began digging through Dan's belongings and stumbled upon a conversation on his phone. Dan had texted Amina asking how she was doing, and Amina had responded, never better. Katie's blood boiled. She convinced herself that Dan and Amina were back together, and that this was why her spell had failed. Dan had long suspected something was wrong. His fragmented memories and Katie's increasingly erratic behavior led him to hire a private investigator. The investigator's findings were damning. Katie had been visiting a voodoo practitioner regularly and paying large sums of money to maintain a spell over him. The practitioner, when confronted, provided documented evidence of Katie's dealings. Armed with this information, Dan made up his mind. He met with his lawyer and prepared divorce papers. That evening he came home ready to deliver them and put an end to the charade. As Dan stepped through the door, Katie was waiting for him. Her eyes were wild with anger. "So you're back with her?" she spat. "How?" Dan froze. "What are you talking about?" "You and Amina," Katie shouted. "I saw the message you sent her." Dan's expression darkened. "After everything you've done, you think I don't know. You take me for a fool." He pulled the divorce papers from his bag and handed them to her. "It's over, Katie." Katie stared at the papers, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of her actions began to sink in. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice breaking. Dan remained firm. He took out his phone and called Katie's father. "I've handed Katie the divorce papers," he said. "You may want to come over and help with the situation." Katie, overcome with rage and despair, yelled and tried to fight Dan, but he stayed calm. Their children, awakened by the commotion, began crying, adding to the chaos. When Katie's parents arrived, Dan quickly explained the situation and decided it would be best to leave for the night. He packed a small bag and left for a hotel, hoping some distance would help diffuse the tension. The next day, Katie stormed to the voodoo practitioner's place, frantic and desperate for answers. But the practitioner refused to see her. When Katie finally forced her way in, the woman coldly stated, "The spell no longer works. It's over." Katie, unable to accept the truth, screamed in panic, tears streaming down her face. "He's divorcing me. You must fix this," she pleaded. But the practitioner simply shook her head and dismissed Katie, leaving her sobbing and broken. Back home, Katie spiraled further into despair. She began calling Amina continuously, accusing her of breaking up a family and begging her to leave Dan. Amina, unwilling to engage, ignored further calls from her. When Katie's harassment intensified, Amina blocked her number and informed Dan of the situation. Dan was furious when he heard what Katie was doing. "I'm so sorry for this," he told Amina. "I've handed her the divorce papers, and the process is almost complete. You might want to change your number to find some peace. Don't worry, I know how to reach you." 3 weeks later, the divorce was finalized. With the overwhelming evidence against her, including the voodoo practitioner's testimony, Katie had no chance to contest it. Dan was granted custody arrangements for his 2 children and moved forward with his life, leaving Katie behind to face the consequences of her actions. 2 weeks after the divorce, Dan traveled to the city where Amina had relocated, determined to make amends and win her back. He found himself standing outside her office building, nervous but resolute. When Amina saw him, she was surprised but composed. "Dan," she said, her tone guarded, "what are you doing here?" "I came to see you," he replied. "I know I've made so many mistakes, but I'm here to make things right. I I still love you, Amina. I always have." Amina looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Dan, I've built a new life here. I've worked hard to heal and move forward. I'm not sure I can trust you again." "I understand," Dan said earnestly, "but there's something you need to know. I hired a private investigator. and I found out that Katie had cast a spell on me. That's why my mind felt wiped, why I couldn't remember how I ended up with her. It wasn't just me failing you. I was manipulated in ways I couldn't control. I'm so sorry, Amina. If I could go back and change it all, I would. Amina's expression softened as she processed his words. Hearing this truth stirred a mix of emotions within her. She felt a pang of sympathy for Dan, but also a lingering hesitation. That explains a lot, she admitted quietly. I I'm sorry you went through that. I'm not asking for forgiveness right away, Dan continued. I just want a chance to prove that I've changed, that I'm not the man who hurt you. Please, Amina, give me a chance. Amina sighed, her walls slowly crumbling under the sincerity in his voice. Dan, I need time, but maybe we can start by talking. Dan nodded, relief washing over him. That's all I ask. As they walked to a nearby cafe to talk, the air between them felt heavy with unspoken emotions, but also a glimmer of hope. Both knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, they felt the possibility of rebuilding what was lost. The end. Thank you for watching. Please input your thought and any suggestions in the comment. If you find the story valuable, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until then, see you on the next one.